Hey everyone, welcome to the Wood Samaritan. Today I'm going to show you how I took this old junk wood destined for the landfill and turned it into this awesome cornhole board game set. Let's get started. The design for this set came off a set of free plans I found on the internet. I'll leave a link to those below if you're interested in building this for yourself. Now, the great thing about this project, it's super easy to build. Even if you don't have all the tools that I do, a circular saw, a drill, some screws, a bit of glue, and you're good to go. You can also build this out of scrap, or if you want to buy materials, just regular lumber, construction lumber from your big box store, more than good enough. As you can see, this wood was a bit gnarly. Lots of nails, lots of splits. First thing that needed to happen was to get all the junky bits off of it and get down to the usable wood. Starting with the miter saw, I cut off the split bits and then cleaned it up a bit and headed over to the table saw. The plans I had called for roughly 2x4s, but I just took the 2x6s and basically split them in half to get 2 even pieces. Next, it was over to the plywood. I started by cutting off the rotten and split bit off the end and marked out the 2-foot section I needed for the top of the cornhole boards. The Craig AccuCut track saw attachment here came in super handy to get nice, clean, straight cuts. I'll leave a link below if you're interested in that product. I also noticed the date stamps on this plywood from July of 1990. Nothing like using 30-year-old wood. Next, over to the miter saw, I measured out the lengths of the pieces I needed and started to cut out the different bits. Tried to choose the best sections of these bits of wood to make sure we weren't getting too many split bits or nail holes. After measuring the end to confirm the width, I subtracted that from the 2-foot wide piece we needed and cut the cross pieces for the tops of the boards. After getting all the pieces cut to length, I took them over to the jointer and shaved off about a 30-second from all sides just to clean up the faces a little bit. They were pretty gross after 30 years of use. After a quick sand, these pieces were ready to go. Next, I moved on to the plywood. As you can see, the side that was face up during its life was pretty well used and heavily marked, but after sanding it, I was quite happy with how it came out. Ended up with kind of a weathered, reclaimed look that was going to be perfect for the style of the boards I was going to create here. After that, it was time to set up the Craig K4 jig and drill all the pocket holes in the pieces so they were ready to join together. This really is a fantastic tool, especially with the dust collection. It doesn't make much mess and makes it really easy to assemble quickly and get nice tight joints. After that, it was assembly time. Grabbed the green outdoor glue, the waterproof glue, grabbed the clamps and started to put in the pocket screws to get the main frame assembled together. Because I wasn't really building furniture or anything structural here, I wasn't super worried about getting it perfectly square, but I did kind of eyeball it just to make sure it would look good. On this last piece here, I did have a little bit of a twist in this board. So I used the clamp to pivot on the one screw that was already in to get it lined up to put the other screw in. Once that was done, threw some glue down on the underside of the plywood and grabbed the frame and dropped it on top. I did cut the plywood oversized so I could trim it down after, so I just roughly lined it up to make sure there was a bit of overhang on all 4 sides, clamped it down quickly, and started to screw in the pocket holes. Once that was done, I threw some more clamps on just to hold it while the glue set, flipped it over so I could mark out where the hole was going to go. After marking center and 9 inches down from the top, I grabbed the compass, set it to 3 inches, and drew the circle. Drilling one hole so I could get the blade for the jigsaw in, I started to cut the circle out. I realized part of the way around that my clamps were going to be in the way, so it took a quick second to flip those around so I could get it going. And cut the rest of the circle out. With the circle cut out, I grabbed my chisel and just cleaned up the start of the circle where there was a bit of a edge. And then I knocked down the sharp corners with 150 sandpaper and then used the 220 to make it a little bit smoother. With the holes done, it was time to work on trimming the plywood edge. I grabbed my router and flush trim bit. If you haven't seen one of these before, it has a bearing on the bottom that rides against the edge of the piece of wood underneath that you're trying to trim up to and cuts away the overhang piece of wood, giving you a nice even joint. This is really a great tool, gives you a nice clean finish. It's also great when you don't have an exactly straight piece of wood underneath it, but you want to get it very flush. After that, it was time for a round over. I grabbed, this is a 1/4 inch round over bit, again with a bearing that rides along, and it just essentially, like it says, rounds over the corner. After doing this, I did notice one spot where the plywood was starting to delaminate. Because it was right at the edge, I decided to fix this. I'm using a 2-part CA glue. I'm not even going to try and attempt to say the words that CA stands for, but essentially it's crazy glue. This is the glue itself, and then there is a second part, an activator spray, which you'll see in a moment here. So I'm just trying to get it as much into the groove as I can, and then I'm holding it down with a small piece of scrap wood here. This stuff does stick to gloves, fingers, basically anything very permanently. So if you don't want your finger skin coming off, then don't use your finger to hold it down while you put the activator on. As you can kind of see, it dries in about 3 or 4 seconds. You can almost see it crystallizing after the spray goes on. Much more solid now with that part done. Another benefit of this glue too is it's sandable within a minute or so after applying it. With the main assembly complete, it was time to mark out the lines for where the white triangle of paint was going to go in the middle of the boards. Using a straight edge here, I'm just drawing the lines with pencil, give myself a guide. Then I grab my green painter's tape, applying the tape in line with the pencil line. That was a great little trick I learned from someone else on YouTube. Can't remember exactly who it was now, but whenever you want to get really clean paint lines on an uneven surface, put down your painter's tape like you normally would, then run a bead of some type of paintable caulking. Ideally, I'm using DAP here, it works quite well, right along the joint of the painter's tape and the surface that you're going to paint. Use your finger to push it down and squish it into essentially the grooves where the painter's tape may not be perfectly adhering. Wipe away any extra with your finger, then just go ahead and paint right over those edges, ideally with a roller. It disturbs the caulking a lot less than the bristles of a brush. You're going to want to do this fairly quickly. You need to get that painter's tape off before the caulking has a chance to develop a skin or dry at all. That way the tape can essentially cut a clean line along the caulking and the edge of the paint, and the caulking will have stopped any of that paint from squeezing underneath the tape into where there may have been some gaps. With that first coat on, I started to remove the painter's tape. The trick here is to pull it back along the line of the tape at about a 45-degree angle outwards from the tape. This pulls the silicone and the paint that is on the tape away from itself and essentially cuts a line into that. As you can see, it does quite a nice job. It's never 100% perfect, but usually the parts that need touch up are very minimal and generally have a very nice clean paint line, especially on an uneven surface. After a couple more coats of the white paint and allowing it to fully dry, I moved on to the top coat, which is a water-based polyurethane and a satin finish. I'm just applying this with a brush here directly over top. After getting a couple of coats on and letting them dry, I did a quick sand with 400 grit sandpaper just to make everything a bit more smooth and did more coats. Next, it was onto the leg assembly. Here I'm marking out the center for the round end that I'm going to cut onto these legs so that they can pivot. I found this random metal clamp that ended up giving me the shape that I wanted. After tracing that on, I used my jigsaw to cut off the bulk of the material. I then took them over to the sanding belt and rounded the edges right down to my line that I'd drawn. With that done, it was time to mark out where I wanted the legs to sit on the board. I used my ruler to give a little bit of space so I didn't have to worry about the round end pinching against the board at all if it didn't happen to be perfectly round, which it probably wasn't. Clamped it where I wanted it, and then put in the bit for the size of bolt I was going to put through there, and drilled through both pieces at the same time so that they were well aligned. After drilling these, I realized I didn't have enough bolts for all four, and I was going to have to use a few that were shorter. So I created this quick little jig that was the same size as the Forstner bit I wanted to use, clamped it in place so that the Forstner bit would not jump around in the hole that was already there, and was able to drill a little bit of a recess to get the bolt head in further. That way it would stick all the way through and out the other side. I did that on all four and then proceeded to do the final assembly. Put a washer in between just to give it a little bit of space, one on the outside, and then I used the double nut trick to lock them together. So put one on first, tightened it up to the tightness that I wanted, and then I add a second nut on top of that one and tighten the two against each other, essentially locking them in place. I've only showed you most of the build of one of these, but I did do two. Here's the finished product. I think they turned out pretty awesome. I like the white, clean white in combination with the reclaimed rustic wood look. They are extremely sturdy, probably way stronger than they need to be for game boards, but I think they look great. It's a great use of wood. Turns out I'm not very good at it, but oh well. And when you're done, pick them up, fold the legs down, and they're easy to store wherever you like. So that's about it for this one. If you have time, please subscribe or leave a comment below. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Wood Samaritan.